In today's video, we're looking at the latest game played between Magnus Carlsen and Daniel Naroditsky, the Blitz specialist. And in this game, Magnus plays one of the craziest rook sacrifices you will ever see. Trust me on that, so stick around. This game is wild. All right, in the game, Magnus opens 1e4, best by test, and Daniel Naroditsky goes 1c5, likely heading for his favorite knight of Sicilian after the moves knight f3, then d6. But in this game, Magnus is having none of that. He starts knight c3, heading for some sort of anti-Sicilian line, and Daniel goes knight c6. Now here, in this position, the main moves for white are, for example, g3, knight f3, bishop b5, and so on. But instead, he actually goes f4, expanding on the king side in the spirit of the King's Gambit opening. All right, Daniel, the two main moves for black here are g6 and e6. Both of those moves are playable, and in the game, he does go e6, likely heading for a very fast d5, at which point he would have very good control over the center of the board. Now here, Magnus continues knight f3, and sure enough, Daniel does go d5 immediately. Now, I do want to point out, for some reason, the computer says here knight h6 before going d5 is the more precise move order. If you understand why that is the case, drop a comment down below. I do love opening theory, but this one I cannot figure out. Stockfish, for some reason, saying knight h6 first is the way to go. Instead, in the game, Daniel d5 is the move, breaking in the center, a very solid move, and now Magnus does go bishop b5, exerting pressure on that knight on c6. Of course, now it is pinned to the king on e8, as that pawn is no longer on d7. Therefore, a very strong move, and overall here, Magnus is fighting for maybe a small advantage out of the opening. All right, now here, Daniel, he knows that. He goes knight e7. This is the strongest move in the position, and the idea being if white takes on c6, then you recapture with your other knight, and you are doing just fine. So this is one of the benefits of this e6 d5 setup. The knight can go to e7, where it does support the other pony on c6. All right, now here, white takes on d5, e takes d5, and believe it or not, black does have a choice. You can take back with the pawn, e takes d5, or with the knight. Now, in the game, knight takes d5 chosen, and this move to me is very, very interesting. I mean, one of the possibilities here, Magnus can take on c6 immediately, bishop takes c6, and the benefit of that move from white's perspective, yes, you are giving up that bishop pair. You no longer have those two b's. However, in return, you do permanently damage black's pawn structure after b takes c6, and that would be very, very interesting. Of course, you don't have to do that. The strongest move here is just knight e5, piling up pressure on that knight. But interestingly enough, Magnus here, he does trade on c6. So bishop takes c6 played in the game. Of course, black must recapture. B takes c6. And now we have the move knight e5, piling up pressure on c6 once again. Now here, black, or Daniel, whatever you want to say, he actually ignores the threat of knight takes c6, and instead bishop d6 was played, and this turns out to be the strongest move in the position. The point being, if you take on c6 with the knight, then the pawn on f4 falls, and beyond that, black is threatening ideas like queen to h4, and black could have a very large initiative on the king side. That would be very, very dangerous. So with that in mind here, knight takes c6, not played by the goat. Instead, d3 was played, bolstering f4, therefore renewing the threat of knight takes c6. All right, now here, turns out the strongest continuation for Daniel is actually taking on e5, giving up your bishop. The point being, for example, after bishop takes f takes, you can fly in with the queen to h4 check, hitting the king, and if white goes g3, then you have the move queen d4. The queen is tremendously centralized. You are threatening e5, and overall, black would have a massive initiative as the white king is stuck in the center. Short castles would not be possible as the queen does control that square. However, that was not played in the game. Instead, right here, instead of bishop takes e5, short castles was played by Daniel. All right, now here, Magnus, he castles as well. Short castles, missing the idea of queen to f3, maybe setting up long castles. That would have been a little bit more precise, but overall, short castles also a fine move. All right, now here, Daniel, instead of knight takes c3, that is perhaps the best continuation. Here he goes for the good old-fashioned Ben Feingold counterattack with the move f6, driving back that knight on e5 and giving Ben Feingold an aneurysm if he saw this game. All right, now, knight c4 played by Magnus, dropping back the knight, opting not to trade on c6, as the knight would be very, very vulnerable on that square. Instead, knight c4 played, pressuring that bishop, and if this bishop does fall, then white regains the bishop. Black no longer has those two Bs on d6 and c8, and therefore white would have a massive advantage with the better pawn structure on the queen side, and even in the center, as the Ben-Feingold counterattack f6 does weaken that e6 pawn permanently. So overall, this bishop must stay alive, therefore bishop c7 played in the game by Daniel. Now we have knight e4, jumping in with that second pony, pressuring c5. Very good by the goat. And now we have queen to e7, bolstering that pawn on c5. All right, now here, Magnus. In this structure, the way you should be continuing is, for example, queen to e1, intending queen f2, queen g3, or even queen to h4, sliding over to the king side with that queen. Instead here, he goes for a very interesting idea, b3. Now, the idea behind this move, I think Magnus wants to pile up pressure on that weak pawn on c5. He's maybe intending bishop a3. You certainly don't want to go bishop b2, as again, the Ben-Feingold counterattack f6 does block the bishop on this diagonal. Therefore, bishop a3, in the spirit of the Nimzo Indian defense as black, piling up pressure on that doubled c-pawn is likely the idea here. All right, now Daniel, he knows he must get some sort of counterplay going immediately if he wants to stay in this game, and therefore he does go f5, knocking back that knight on the e4 square. Where is the knight going to go? In the game, knight g5 was played, piling up pressure again on that very weak pawn on e6, and now it turns out the only good line for black is to break in the center immediately with the very strong move e5. The point being, after e5, f takes e5, and then bishop takes. Yes, white can win back that bishop and eliminate black's bishop pair, but overall, black would have a good amount of activity and he would have a decent game. Instead, way back here, instead of e5, the move played in the game is h6, trying to drive back that knight on g5. Where is the knight going to go? It goes back to f3, but here, Daniel, he jumps in and takes that pawn on f4. He just gobbles it up like the hungry hippo he is. Knight takes f4, winning the pawn. And what is the idea here? Well, it turns out white can actually sacrifice that pawn and still have a massive initiative. The right move here for white, believe it or not, is knight c to e5, and with that knight on the e5 square, pressuring c6 and so on, white has a huge initiative, and black has all of these weaknesses on e5, on g6, h5, and so on the king side, and white can be down a pawn and still be just fine after knight c to e5. Instead, though, bishop takes f4 played in the game, and this move is quite a bit weaker, and here Daniel is fighting back. We have bishop takes f4, then knight f to e5, and now here the right continuation is just bishop takes e5, at which point again Daniel is doing okay. He is defending, but instead queen to h4 played in the game, Daniel being very active with the queen, and this move is very tricky. Of course, white can go g3, forking both the bishop and the queen, but here's the big question. Is that a good idea, or will that lead to an immediate draw by repetition? Well, it's a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to figure out, is g3 the right way forward for Magnus, and will he play that, or will he play something else in the game? And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this. Thank you so much for doing that. It really does help me out a ton. All right, here, turns out g3 is the correct move, but Magnus did not play it in the game. Here's the idea. If you go g3, obviously the threat is bishop takes, then h takes, then queen takes g3, at which point it would be a draw by repetition. You go king h1, queen h3, king g1, queen g3, and so on. That would be a draw. But the point here, g3 is still good. After bishop takes, you don't take back on g3. Instead, you drop back with the knight to f3, hitting the queen, and you avoid the draw by repetition as the queen must move here. That is the entire idea. And of course, the knight also guards h2, stopping bishop takes or queen takes h2 ideas. So overall, in this position right here, g3 is the right move, intending bishop takes and then knight f3. Now, instead, in the game, rook takes f4 was played, by Magnus, believe it or not, and this move is a massive blunder. I mean, I cannot overstate how bad this move right here by Magnus is. I don't know what he's thinking. I mean, comment down below if you've seen a worse move in your life by Magnus. I'm not even exaggerating. This move is just downright awful. I can't even think of a word to describe how bad this is right here. All right, what is the idea? He gives up the rook to avoid the draw, but now black just takes the rook. Queen takes f4, and now here Daniel, he's officially up the exchange and a single pawn. I mean, what is Magnus doing? I don't know. All right, we have queen to e1, slides the queen over, then bishop a6, piling up pressure on that knight on c4. Maybe Daniel wants to trade a bishop, but beyond that, he's activating his very weak rook on a8. So Daniel, he knows you must have all of the pieces in the attack. Very good stuff. All right, knight d2. Magnus retreats the knight, tries to keep both those ponies on the board for now. Now queen d4 hits the king on g1. Where is the king going to go? King to h1 played in the game, then rook f to e8, simply defending that pawn on e6 in advance. But it turns out this was a minor mistake. Instead of rook f to e8, the right move was queen d6, as this pony on d2 is heading to f3, where it will put pressure on that queen on d4. Therefore, queen d6 immediately was the right way forward. Instead, rook f to e8 played in the game. Then we have knight d to f3, hits the queen, queen d6, and now we have c4, gaining space on the queen side, blocking out that bishop, and of course, permanently fixing the weakness on c5. So very good play by Magnus, but don't forget, he is down the exchange, down a pawn. He's going to have a very difficult time defending this game, and he's also down on the clock. I mean, Daniel has 1 minute and 44 seconds to the only 1 minute and 5 seconds of Magnus. That is a massive, massive issue right here. All right, in the game, rook to f8 play by Daniel. Then we have queen to a5. Magnus sliding out with the queen, a very interesting move. I do want to point out, instead of that, queen to h4, expanding on the other side, may have been a little bit more precise. Instead, queen to a5 played in the game, pressuring both c5 and the weak bishop on a6. All right, now here, the bishop must move. Where do you want to go? In the game, bishop b7 played. The point being, you can go to b7 or c8. On b7, you still keep the option of going, say, rook d8 later in the game, but it turns out bishop c8, intending perhaps bishop d7, was a little bit more precise. So, bishop b7 played in the game. Nothing wrong with it per se, but a little bit weaker than bishop c8. Now Magnus, rook e1, sliding over his rook, getting his rook into the game, bolstering his knight on e5, and of course, pressuring the weak pawn on e6 behind it. All right, now Daniel, f4 is the move, gaining space on the king side and freeing up f5 for his rook if he needs it. But it turns out here, the computer actually likes bishop c8 a little better than f4. Go figure. All right, here, Magnus plays my favorite move on the chessboard. I mean, the Ben Feingold counterattack with f6 has nothing on the alpha 0 attack with the move h4. Magnus expanding the h-pawn, gaining space, potentially playing against the idea of g5 from black. But beyond that, he's also setting up the idea of h5 himself, clamping down on those light squares on the king side. I mean, you gotta love a good alpha 0 attack. All right, now here, Daniel, rook f5, sure enough, making good use of that free f5 square when he went f4, freeing up f5 on the prior move. Now Magnus, king g1, sliding his king over, and here, Daniel, queen to d8, offering the queen trade. But the problem with this move, if white takes on d8, that is fine for black. But the problem is, this move, queen d8, gives up the defense of the pawn on c5. And here, queen takes c5 is a free pawn. If Magnus plays that, queen takes c5, he is almost equal in this game somehow, some way, fighting back despite being down the exchange. The point being, this bishop on b7 is almost useless. I mean, whether it's on b7, a6, c8, or d7, it is virtually useless. And therefore, despite being down the exchange, Magnus would be doing relatively okay for now. But instead, he does not take the free pawn. Instead, he goes for the endgame with queen takes d8. And this is a massive mistake, as you can see by the eval bar collapsing one more time. Look at that eval bar just just collapse in the favor of Daniel Naroditsky, the Blitz specialist. All right, we have queen takes, then rook takes, then king to f2, centralizing the king. Magnus here trying to fight back, but Daniel staying cool, calm, and collected like the cucumber he is. He goes a5, expanding on the queen side with the alpha 0 a pawn. Now we have rook e2, rook king h7, king to e1, getting his king behind the rook, then rook to a8, bolstering a5 and threatening a4, potentially trying to open up that a file. Magnus, he knows this. He goes a4, closing down the a file with the alpha 0 a pawns touching. How cute. Now rook to g8, threatening g5 ideas, king d2 by the goat, and now sure enough, g5 on the board, gaining space and threatening g takes h4, opening up the g file. Here, Magnus, he's having none of that. He trades on g5, h takes, then knight g4, blockading those pawns on f4 and g5. A solid idea, but now here, Daniel, bishop c8, the slow, long march of the bishop has begun, potentially intending bishop d7, e8, and then g6, or even h5. We'll have to wait and see how it plays out. All right, now, the goat, knight f to e5, jumping up with the knight, king g7, rook to e1, rook h8, Daniel piling up pressure on the h-file, maybe intending rook h4 ideas. Now, king to e2, rook d8, sliding back with the rook, king f2, bishop b7. So far, both sides kind of going back and forth, playing the waiting game. All right, rook h1, rook h8, challenging the h-file, and here Magnus does trade. Rook takes, king takes, and now Magnus, he's still down the exchange, and he has only 19 seconds left on the clock to the 49 seconds of Daniel. This is going to be a very, very tough hold for the greatest chess player of all time. All right, king to f3, king g7, king e4, marching up the king is the goat. Now bishop c8 defending, knight f3, king g6, knight f to e5, king h5. The weird king march. All right, king f3, rook to f8, king f2, rook f5, king f3, rook f8, king f2, and here in this position, if Daniel goes rook f5, that would be a draw on the spot, but instead he goes rook to h8, and it turns out this move right here, for very complicated reasons, is a massive blunder, and Magnus is fighting back. King to f3, the right move. Now bishop b7, and here knight to f6, the goat jumping in with his knights, maybe intending knight d7 ideas, piling up pressure on the indefensible pawn on c5. All right, Daniel continues fighting. King to h6, knight e4, rook g8, knight takes c5. Magnus now down. Let's see, he has the extra knight and the extra pawn versus the extra rook of Daniel. That is almost even material, especially when you consider that bishop on b7 is virtually useless in this position. It's acting like a giant pawn, not to mention being under attack by the knight. All right, now here, what will Daniel do? He goes bishop c8, retreating the bishop and trying to dominate that knight. Is the bishop dominating the knight, or is the knight dominating the bishop? I'm not sure. Comment down below which one it is. I am at a loss here. All right, king g4 played in the game. King g7, d4, gaining space. Now king to f6, a slightly dubious move. Instead, king h6 would have been a little more precise. Instead, king to f6 in the game, a dubious move by Daniel. Now knight e4 hits the king e7, and here, Magnus, all he has to do is knight takes c6, winning the free pawn, then winning a5, and he would actually have winning chances. But instead here, in the game, knight takes g5 played, and this move is significantly weaker. Here, Daniel has the option of king to f6, piling up pressure on the pinned knight. That would be enough to win the game, as there is no way to defend it. Instead, in the game, c5 played, a very curious move, and now here, king takes f4, king to f6, and here the knight on g5 is no longer pinned. Of course, with the king on g4, that would be winning, but here instead, white has the option of knight to e4, hitting the king and then taking on c5. That is the strongest line. Instead, knight g to f3 played in the game, and don't forget, Magnus has literally less than 1 second left on the clock. That is why his timer doesn't even show here. Daniel has 10 seconds. He goes king to e7, and in this position, Magnus, despite being winning or very close to it, He runs out of time on the clock. His timer is showing up here above the king. That means he is out of time, and therefore he loses on the spot to Daniel Naroditsky. Wow, what a game between the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen, and Daniel Naroditsky in this crazy Blitz game from January 21st, 2025. And especially, what a ridiculous rook sacrifice. Rook takes f4 right here. I mean, comment down below if this is the worst move you've ever seen Magnus play in a Blitz game online. This has got to be up there. I mean, you don't see Magnus intentionally, like, you can't call it a blunder, because if you blunder, it's like you dropped a piece accidentally. This is no accident. This is a very intentional move, giving up the rook for the bishop when g3 was right there. I mean, this has got to be the worst move I've ever seen him intentionally make. So anyways, that is all for today. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button and comment down below again what you thought of this video. And if you want to see more Magnus versus Daniel Naroditsky action, check out this video right here where I cover yet another one of their craziest games. So check that video out, and I'll see you in the next video.